US President Joe Biden and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson have met for the first time ahead of the Group of Seven summit on Friday. The two leaders described their meeting as very productive, and the talks kicked off the first leg of Biden's European trip. Olly Barratt has more from Cornwall.
There were concerns heading into these talks that the two men might not get along, partly because of things that Joe Biden has said about Boris Johnson in the past, partly because of concerns we know Washington has about Brexit and about the Northern Irish peace process. But the atmospherics here in Cornwall have been good. Both men talking about their productive talks and feeling that there is a lot that the UK and US can cooperate on.
We've had a good first full day here in the UK. Prime Minister Johnson and I had a very productive meeting. We discharged and discussed a broad range of issues on which the United Kingdom and the United States are working in very close cooperation.
It's wonderful to listen to the Biden administration and to Joe Biden, because there's so much that they want to do together with us, from security, NATO, to climate change, and it's fantastic. It's a breath of fresh air.
And now we start to head into the G7 summit period, kicking off on Friday. Health preparedness, pandemic preparedness, cooperation on issues like climate change as well among G7 nations will be very high on the agenda. The UK is trying to prove over the coming days that actually the G7 can be important. It can collaborate and cooperate in meaningful ways. It also wants to show that democracies can come together and show unity and strength. Britain is also trying to prove that it can continue to be relevant on the international stage. Having left the European Union, it can still be a power broker, it can still be a global player that is listened to. The UK government will be thrilled with how the initial part of proceedings have kicked off, those talks between Joe Biden and Boris Johnson, but it will also know that there could be potentially challenging days ahead in terms of some of the items to be discussed and whether anything can actually be achieved.
Well, leaders of the Group of Seven nations will begin a three-day meeting on Friday in Cornwall, England. They're expected to discuss topics including COVID-19 vaccines, economic recovery and climate change. And this year, South Korea will also attend parts of the summit. For more details, we're now joined by our correspondents Phoebe Amoroso in Tokyo and Shing Ham in Seoul. I'll start with you, Phoebe. What are the key messages we can expect to hear from Japan on G7?
Well, Prime Minister Suga has many things on his mind, as you mentioned, COVAX program, as well as the response to the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. But one key thing will be the Olympics. Japan has had strong criticism, both internationally and domestically, about their decision to proceed with holding the events. So Prime Minister Suga has specifically said that he is looking to gain understanding on that issue. And then there is also the case of Japan and South Korea relations. They have fallen to one of their lowest points in recent years. And just last week, a top Japanese official was quoted as saying there was no plans for a meeting between the two sides on the sidelines. However, on Monday, a South Korean court threw out a compensation claim regarding forced labor during Japan's colonial rule of Korea. And that was a very different direction from a ruling in 2018 in which it was decided that Japanese companies should pay compensation. And that's what's led to the spiraling of the relations downwards. And this is the second surprise court ruling this year. In April, a South Korean court dismissed a compensation claim brought by comfort women, the women who were forced to work in Japan's military brothels, saying that Japan is immune under international law. And that was a very different ruling from what we heard in January. So there's signs that the South Korea side is making steps towards warming those relations, and Prime Minister Suga has described South Korea as a very important neighbour. The finance ministers from both sides met in May, and that did not lead to any major progress. Japan said that South Korea still needs to respect international law. South Korea saying that Japan needs to get its history facts straight. But one thing that we might see from this current G7 summit is President Joe Biden. He's already expressed his intent to try and unite both countries. He wants to bring about a stronger union in the region and present a stronger front against China. So he'll be working to try and warm up those relations. However, the divisions remain very deep, so it may take some time.
Thank you very much, Phoebe. And now let's turn to Shane Harmin. So, Shane, South Korea is invited as well this time. What are South Korea's expectations then?
Well, of course, South Korea is not a formal member of the G7. President Moon will be attending this week's meetings by invitation, along with the leaders of other invited countries like Australia, South Africa, and India. Interestingly enough, the invitations were extended by U.S. President Trump, the previous administration, back when he was in power last year, when he was the head, or when the U.S. was the head of the G7 at the time. But President Moon certainly pleased to have literally a seat at the table here. He said that this invitation reflects the rise of South Korea's international stature to a, quote, level on par with G7 members. And South Korea certainly has a lot to contribute to these major agenda items that the G7 leaders will be discussing, including the global health crisis. South Korea is trying to be a major player here in the region as a global vaccine hub. Climate change is something that President Moon is high on his agenda of policies, both domestic and regionally as well as trade disputes. You know, South Korea is in an interesting situation where, for instance, between the United States and China, the trade disputes that exist, South Korea cannot afford to have relations go bad with either side. So South Korea could play the role of mediator, something that President Moon has said he's open to playing that role. But as far as any formal meetings, something that a lot of experts here will be watching out for, any formal meetings with the Japanese Prime Minister, the presidential office here denying any claims that there will be any such meetings. But if such a meeting does occur, as they do with these multilateral summits, something called pull-asides, we could see President Biden and a trilateral meeting being discussed. But as far as bilateral issues between Seoul and Tokyo, not many experts here are expecting anything to come out of that.
All right, thank you very much, Shing Ham, reporting from Seoul. Well, leaders of 7 of the world's major economies are meeting for talks at Seaside Resort in southwest England. The G7 summit, as it is known, is held annually, except for last year when it was cancelled for the first time since 1975 due to the COVID pandemic. So what is the Group of 7 and how did it form? Let's take a look at the package understanding that.
The G7 is a group of the world's 7 largest so-called advanced economies. Its origins, however, trace back to a period of economic downturn. Nearly 5 decades on, what began as private meetings between finance ministers has turned into a high-level forum involving leaders of some of the world's wealthiest nations. Its membership has fluctuated over the years, from a group of 5 to 6 to 8, then back to 7. The group is separate from the G20, which is a larger bloc that includes all G7 nations. Every year, member countries take turns hosting a summit to discuss global issues and potential solutions. Non-members are sometimes invited as guests. EU officials have been regular attendees since the early 1980s. The G7 is known for being informal in nature, allowing for what it calls frank and direct dialogue among world leaders. Each summit ends with financial and political commitments, but member countries are not legally bound to these commitments. Because of its clout, statements and support from the G7 are seen to have global influence. G7 backing can help advance projects by governments and international organizations such as the United Nations and the World Bank. But over the years, there's been criticism over the G7's relevance, partly because it excludes India and China, 2 of the world's largest countries and emerging economies. In recent years, G7 forums have been marked with protests, while actions by some of its members have raised questions over its status as a platform for multilateralism. This year, COVID-19 and recovery from the pandemic will be front and center of the G7 summit, along with crucial talks on trade and climate change. Jen Kwan, CGTN.
Now we're now joined by Mr. Teng Jianqun on the phone. He's the director of the American Studies Department at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, Professor Teng. Well, relations between the U.S. and EU have been rocky since Donald Trump was in office. What can Biden do to turn that relations around?
Yeah, this is actually a policy by Biden administration. Since he took the office, he has attached importance to the traditional relationship across Atlantic Ocean. And I think this is actually one part of his policy toward the so-called strategic competition with China, Asia Pacific region. So the United States would like to maintain a stable and good relation with the European countries so he can continue to benefit from the cooperation with the European countries, between the European countries and the United States. And I think this time Biden, the President of the United States, had tried his best to resume the relationship, deeply hurt by the former President Donald Trump. But I don't think the European countries can, return to the old track as they did during the Cold War time, because, in some areas, for example, Iranian nuclear issue, regional security, anti-terrorism, and climate change, European countries also have their own interests and own intention to continue their momentum in these areas, in these issues. So I think this time, by the effort of Biden's administration, the relationship across Atlantic Ocean might be resumed to some extent in a normal track, but I don't think the European countries will give 100 support to the so-called strategic competition with major powers this time by U.S. government.
Well, this meeting is actually a rather enlarged meeting. Some U.S. allies like South Korea and Australia are also invited to the summit. So how would you interpret U.S. invitation and their presence at the summit?
Yeah, the invitation of Australia and South Korea to G7 summit actually is a tricky policy by Biden administration. As we discussed just now, Biden administration, resumed the so-called military alliance in international affairs, which has been a most important part to support the dominant position of the United States or the major power in the world since World War II. So military alliance or some partners in this time should be the most important part of this so-called strategic competition policy by the U.S. government. And the President of the United States would like to manipulate the so-called alliance with the United States for the U.S. sake. For example, Australia has been a good follower since World War II in almost all the wars initiated by the United States. And this time, I think a little bit tricky is the attitude or the position by South Korea government. President Moon Jae-in would like to maintain a little bit independent policy toward the United States, toward China, but the U.S. government, especially President Biden, has put great pressure on the current leaders in South Korea. They would like to invite South Korea to be one part or most important part in the so-called strategic competition with China in Northeast Asia. So this is a tricky policy by the Biden administration, and I think the invitation just gave a strong signal that the United States would like to continue the so-called strategic competition with China in Asia-Pacific region.
Thank you very much, Professor Teng Jianqun, Director of the American Studies Department at the China Institute of International Studies.